She dragged a case into the barn. What Cowboy found inside left them frozen. The wind came first. It swept down from the mountains and rolled across the valley like a warning nobody wanted to hear. Elias Voss felt it against his neck, cold and sharp, and he pulled his worn collar higher. The sky above him had turned the color of old iron. Somewhere far off, thunder muttered like a man talking in his sleep. He knelt in the dirt beside a broken fence post. His hands, rough and cracked from years of hard work, gripped a length of wire. He twisted it tight around the post, then pulled. The wire bit into his palms. He barely noticed. His hands had stopped feeling small pains a long time ago. "Come on," he muttered. "Just hold. Just this once." The post leaned anyway. It always leaned. The whole ranch leaned these days, like it was tired of standing up. Elias sat back on his heels and looked out across his land. The grass had gone brown and thin. His cattle huddled together near the far ridge, maybe a dozen of them where there used to be hundreds. They sensed the storm coming. So did he. He could feel it in his knees and in the ache behind his eyes. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story 43 years old, and some days he felt twice that. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and stood. His body cracked and groaned. The light was fading fast now, the sun swallowed whole by the coming clouds. He needed to finish before the rain came, but his eyes drifted, the way they always did, to the one place he never wanted them to go. The old barn. It sat at the edge of his property, dark and silent. The wood had gone gray. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken spine. Weeds grew tall against its walls, and the big front doors hung crooked on rusted hinges. He had not stepped inside in years. He could not. That barn held everything he had lost. He remembered Daniel running through those doors, laughing, chasing the barn cats. He remembered Abigail leaning against the frame with a basket of eggs on her hip, calling him in for supper. Her voice. He could still hear her voice if he let himself, but he tried not to. Hearing it hurt worse than any wire cutting into his hands. They were gone now. Both of them. Taken from him in a single terrible season, when powerful men decided a cattle dispute was worth more than the lives of a woman and a boy. He had wanted to fight back then. God, he had wanted to burn the whole world down. But fighting had cost him everything, and so he had stopped. He had learned to be quiet. He had learned to survive. That was all he did now. Survive. A cold drop of rain struck his cheek, then another. He looked up as the clouds finally broke open, and the rain came down in a rush, heavy and gray, drumming against the earth. Within seconds, his shirt was soaked through and clinging to his back. "Wonderful," he said to no one. He turned toward the house, meaning to grab his tools and get inside before the mud swallowed his boots. But something stopped him. A movement. It came from near the barn, a small dark shape struggling through the sheets of rain. At first, he thought it was a stray calf, lost and frightened by the storm. He squinted, wiping the water from his eyes. It was not a calf. It was a person. A young woman, bent low against the wind, her dress soaked and heavy with mud. She was fighting her way forward, one slow step at a time. And behind her, she dragged something. An old leather case, big and battered, leaving a long dark scar in the mud as she pulled it along. Elias stood frozen for a moment, unable to believe his eyes. No one came out this way. No one came here at all. The woman stumbled. She caught herself, then pushed on, gripping the case's handle with both hands like her life depended on it. Elias's heart began to pound. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice torn away by the wind. "Hey, you there!" He started running toward her through the storm. The rain hit them both like a wall as Elias reached her. Up close, she looked even smaller. Her lips had gone pale, almost blue, and her whole body shook. But her hands still gripped that case, like it was the only thing keeping her alive. "Give me your arm," Elias shouted over the storm. She looked up at him. Her eyes were wide and full of something he knew too well. Fear. Deep, bone-deep fear. "The case," she gasped. "I need the case." "I've got it, come on." He reached for the handle, and for one moment, she pulled it away from him, clutching it tighter. Then her legs buckled, and she nearly went down into the mud. Elias caught her under the arm. "I'm not going to take it," he said. "I'm just trying to help you. But we can't stay out here. This storm will kill us both." She stared at him a heartbeat longer. Then she nodded. Elias grabbed the case with one hand and held her steady with the other. It was heavier than he expected. The leather was cracked and old, and something inside it shifted and thumped as he lifted it. He half carried, half dragged the both of them toward the nearest shelter. The barn. He did not think about it. There was no time to think. The house was too far, and she was too weak. The barn was right there. So he pushed through the crooked doors, and for the first time in years, Elias Voss stepped inside the place he had sworn he never would. The smell hit him first. Old hay and dust and something else. Something that lived only in memory. He shoved it down. Not now. He set the woman down against a stack of moldy hay bales and dropped the case beside her. She reached for it at once, pulling it close against her chest like a child holding a doll. Elias grabbed an old horse blanket off a nail and shook the dust from it. He draped it over her shaking shoulders. "There," he said. "It's not much, but it's dry." She pulled it tight around herself. Her teeth chattered. "Thank you," she whispered. The rain hammered the roof above them. Water dripped through a hole in the corner, tapping a steady rhythm against the dirt floor. Lightning flashed outside, and for a moment the whole barn lit up white. Elias crouched down a few feet from her. He kept his voice low and easy, the way he used to talk to spooked horses. "What's your name?" She said nothing. "Where'd you come from? There's no town for miles out this way." Still nothing. She just watched him, her eyes darting to the doors, then back to him. "Look," he said. "I helped you. Least you can do is tell me who I'm sheltering under my roof." Her chin lifted a little. There was steel in her under all that shaking. "I can't tell you that," she said. "It's better if you don't know?" Elias frowned. "Better for who?" "For you." He let out a slow breath and rubbed his wet face. "Lady, I've had a long day and a longer year. I don't have the strength for riddles." Her arms tightened around the case. "All I can tell you is this. This case can never be found by the wrong people. Do you understand me?" "Never." "The wrong people," he repeated. "And who might that be?" She shook her head hard. "The less you know, the safer you are." Thunder cracked, so loud and close it shook the walls. Dust rained down from the rafters. The woman flinched and pressed herself back against the hay. And then she said the words that changed everything. "If dangerous men find this case," she said, her voice trembling but certain, "an innocent man will die before sunrise." Elias went still. He had heard those kinds of words before. He had lived them, and he recognized the look on her face now, because he had worn it once himself. It was the look of someone with everything to lose. He stared at the battered old case in her arms. His heart pounded slow and heavy. Whatever was inside it had chased this woman through a storm and into his life. He needed to know what it was. "All right," he said quietly. "Then let me see it." For a long moment, she did not move. Her fingers stayed locked around the handle, white at the knuckles. Elias did not push. He just waited, the way he had learned to wait on things that could not be forced. Then slowly, she loosened her grip. You have to understand, she said. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. There's no going back for you after this. There hasn't been any going back for me in a long time, Elias said. Something in his voice must have reached her. She studied his face one more time. Then she set the case flat on the dirt floor between them and slid it toward him an inch. Elias rose and crossed to the far wall. There, hanging on the same rusted nail it had always hung on, was an old lantern. He lifted it down. The glass was thick with dust, but the wick still held. He struck a match against the wood, and the small flame caught with a hiss. Warm gold light pushed back the dark. He carried it over and set it beside the case. The two of them knelt in the little circle of light while the storm raged on outside. Elias worked the two brass clasps. They were stiff with age and rust. The first one gave with a snap. The second fought him a moment longer, then popped free. He lifted the lid. The first thing he saw was paper. Stacks of it. Old letters, dozens of them, tied together with faded string. The edges were yellow and soft with age. Some still bore the hard red circles of wax seals, cracked now but unbroken. He touched one gently, almost afraid it might crumble under his fingers. Underneath the letters lay something that caught the lantern light and threw it back. A badge. Elias reached in and drew it out. It was a sheriff's star, 6 points of tarnished metal heavy in his palm. The surface was scratched and dull, but he could still read the faded letters stamped across the center. His thumb ran over them slow. "Where'd you get this?" he asked. The woman did not answer. She was watching his hands. He set the badge down and kept looking. Beneath it were folded documents, thick and official, the kind he had seen only a few times in his life. Land papers. He unfolded one carefully. The ink had gone brown, but the words were clear enough. Names of families, numbers marking acres and boundaries, signatures at the bottom, some shaky, some bold. He did not recognize most of the names, but something about them tugged at him, like a word on the tip of his tongue. He set the papers aside and reached deeper. His fingers closed around a stiff square of card. He drew it up into the light and turned it over. It was a photograph. A man stared back at him from the faded print. He was older, with a broad gray mustache and eyes that seemed to look straight through the years. He wore a dark coat and a stern, honest face. Elias knew that face. Everyone in the valley knew that face, even the ones too young to have ever met the man. "That's Judge Whitmore," Elias breathed. Beside him, the woman went very still. "Judge Thomas Whitmore," Elias said again. He could hardly believe the name coming out of his own mouth. The one who vanished. Must be 20 years back now. They said outlaws got him. Said they never even found the body. He looked up at her. "Why do you have a picture of a dead man in this case?" She did not answer. Her jaw was tight, her eyes bright in the lantern glow. Elias looked back down. There was one thing left in the case. A small book, bound in worn leather, its cover soft and stained from handling. A journal. He lifted it out. The spine cracked when he opened it. The pages were filled with tight, careful handwriting, line after line, page after page. His eyes moved over the words, slow at first, then faster. Land taken. Papers changed. Families run off in the night. Names he had never heard, and one or two he had. Then he reached the final entry. The writing there was rushed, pressed hard into the page, as if the hand that wrote it had been shaking. "The men who stole this land do not fear the law," it read. "They own the law." Elias froze. The storm broke some time before dawn. Elias felt it more than heard it. The howling wind that had shaken the barn walls all night grew quiet, then softer still, until only a gentle patter of leftover rain tapped against the roof. Gray light began to creep through the gaps in the old boards. It fell across the dirt floor in thin, pale lines. He had not slept. Neither had she. They still sat by the burned-down stub of the lantern, the journal open between them. Elias had read the final entry a dozen times through the night. The words had stopped feeling like ink and started feeling like a weight pressing on his chest. The men who stole this land do not fear the law. They own the law. The woman stirred. She had wrapped one of his old horse blankets around her shoulders sometime in the night. Her hair had dried in tangles, and there was still mud dried on her sleeves. But her eyes were clear now, awake, watching him. "You know who wrote that," she said. It was not a question. Elias set the journal down soft on his knee. "The judge." She nodded. "You never told me your name," Elias said. She was quiet a moment. Then she pulled the blanket tighter. "Clara," she said. "Clara Whitmore." The name landed in the still morning air, and Elias felt something shift inside him. He looked at her face again, really looked, and saw it now. The line of her jaw, the set of her eyes, the same stubborn honesty stamped into the photograph he still held in his hand. "Whitmore," he said slow. "You're kin to him. He was my grandfather." Her voice caught just a little. "I never met him. He was gone long before I was born." Elias turned the photograph over in his fingers. Outside, a rooster he did not own crowed somewhere off in the wet fields, and the sound felt far away. "The whole valley knows the story," Elias said, "or thinks it does." Judge Whitmore rode out one night to face a band of outlaws that had been running cattle through the pass. Never came back. They searched for weeks. Found his horse, they said? Found his hat? Never found him. He shook his head. 20 years. Folks have told that story. How the good judge died trying to bring law to a lawless place. How the outlaws got him and buried him where no one would ever look. "That's the story they wanted people to believe," Clara said. Elias looked up. "There were no outlaws," she said. "Not the way they told it. My family carried that story like a stone for 20 years. My mother grew up believing her father was a hero cut down doing his duty. And the rest of the town, they believed something worse. Some of them said he was a coward, said he ran, said he took money and disappeared and let the outlaws take the blame." Her hands trembled, and she pressed them flat against her knees. "I grew up not knowing which was true, whether to be proud of him or ashamed of him." "And now?" Elias asked. Clara reached out and turned the journal back to a page near the middle. She pointed to a line written in that same careful hand before it had started to shake. Elias read it, then he read it again. "If they find me, I am a dead man. So I must become a ghost of my own making. Let them believe I am gone. It is the only way I can keep watching. It is the only way I can keep her safe." Elias felt his breath go tight in his chest. "He didn't die," Elias said low. "He didn't die that night at all." "No," Clara whispered. "He ran, but not because he was a coward. He ran because he had to disappear to stay alive, because someone in this valley wanted him dead, and he knew it." Elias's eyes moved back down the page, and now the words came faster, and the meaning behind them turned his blood cold. Land taken, papers forged, poor families blamed for debts they never owed, then run off their own ground in the dark. And behind all of it, one name written again and again in the judge's careful hand. A rich man. A rancher. A man who had built an empire out of other people's ruin and made the whole valley call him a hero for it. The judge had not vanished chasing outlaws. He had vanished chasing the truth. The morning gave way to a gray afternoon. The rain had stopped, but the clouds hung low and heavy over the valley, refusing to break. Elias had brought a fresh lantern from the house, along with bread and cold coffee, though neither of them had eaten much. The old leather case sat open between them on the workbench now. They had moved from the floor to where the light was better. One by one, Clara lifted the letters out, careful as if they might crumble to dust in her hands. Some of them nearly did. The paper had gone brittle and yellow with age. "Here," Clara said. She smoothed one letter flat. "Read this one." Elias leaned close. The handwriting was different this time. Not the judge's steady hand, but something rougher, spelled out slow by someone who had not learned letters easy. "Dear Judge Whitmore, they come to my door again last night, said the bank holds paper on my land, but I never took no loan. My father cleared this ground with his own 2 hands. I got no paper. They got paper. Where did it come from? I am afraid, Judge. My children are afraid." The letter was signed with just a shaking mark, an X, and beneath it, a name written by another hand. Thomas Reed. Elias set it down slow. "The Reeds?" he murmured. "I remember them. When I was a boy. They had a place up past the creek. Then one spring they were just gone. Folks said Thomas Reed drank his money away. Said he couldn't manage his own land? And you believed it," Clara said. "It was not unkind, just true." "Everybody believed it," Elias said quietly. Clara pulled another letter, then another. They came in a flood now, and each one told the same story in a different voice. Land that had been in families for years, suddenly claimed by papers no one remembered signing. Debts that appeared out of nowhere. Men who came in the night with lanterns and hard faces and told good, honest folks they had until morning to leave. And always, threaded through the judge's own notes, the same name. Crow. Silas Crow, Elias read aloud from the journal. He knew the name well. Every soul in the valley did. Crow owned the biggest spread for 50 miles. He gave to the church. He built the schoolhouse. When the winter was hard, it was Crow who brought grain to families who had none. The whole valley called him a savior. Elias read the judge's words again. Crow holds the county clerk in his pocket. He holds the sheriff. He holds men in the capital. When a family cannot pay a debt they never made, Crow buys the land for pennies and calls it charity. He forges the records himself or pays men to do it. I have seen the papers. I have proof. But proof means nothing when the man you accuse owns the very court that would judge him. He built his empire on stolen ground, Elias said. His voice had gone hard, and made everyone thank him for it. My grandfather was going to stop him, Clara said. He gathered all of this, every letter, every record. He was going to bring it to a judge outside the valley, someone Crow couldn't reach. She touched the edge of the journal. That's when Crow found out. That's when my grandfather had to disappear. Elias reached for the land records at the bottom of the case. They were folded thick, tied with faded string. He worked the knot loose with careful fingers and spread the pages across the bench, column after column of names, families, parcels of land, dates, and beside each one, in the judge's hand, a small note. Taken. Forced off. Taken. Elias ran his finger down the list, reading names he half remembered from a childhood that felt like another man's life. Then his finger stopped. His whole body went still. There, near the bottom of the page, written plain in faded ink, was a name he knew better than his own. Voss. Elias Voss, Sr. Below it, in the judge's careful writing, 3 words that turned 20 years of shame to ash in his throat. Land stolen. Innocent. The next morning came pale and quiet. The clouds had finally broken sometime in the night, and thin gold light slipped through the cracks in the barn wall. Elias had not slept much. He had lain awake in the house, staring at the ceiling, seeing those 3 words over and over. Land stolen. Innocent. Now he stood in the barn again, this time with a wooden crate hauled up from the cellar. Inside, it were his father's old papers, the ones he had never been able to throw away and never been able to look at. Bank notices, foreclosure letters. A deed he had once believed marked his family's failure. Clara knelt beside him, spreading the county records the judge had gathered next to Elias's own faded documents. She worked with a careful patience, her fingers moving from one page to the next. "Here," she said softly. "Your father's parcel, 200 acres past the North Ridge." Elias found the matching notice in his father's box. His hands were not steady. He laid the two papers side by side. The county record showed a debt of $600 owed to a bank in the capital. The date was there in black ink. But when Elias looked at the judge's notes beside it, his breath caught. "No loan was ever taken," Elias read aloud. "Signature forged. Compared against tax filing. Does not match." He sat back on his heels. For a long moment, he could not speak. His father had never taken that loan. The signature that had ruined them, that had driven them from their land and left his father a broken man, had been drawn by another hand. Someone had sat down with a pen and stolen everything with a lie. "My father," Elias began, and his voice cracked. He tried again. "My father spent his last years thinking he had failed us. He thought it was his fault. He'd sit by the window and not say a word for days. I used to be ashamed of him. God forgive me. I was ashamed of my own father." Clara reached over and rested her hand on his arm. She said nothing. She only let him feel it. "He wasn't a failure," Elias whispered. "He was robbed. And he died believing the lie they told about him." The old anger rose in Elias like floodwater. But underneath the anger was something else, something that surprised him. It felt almost like grief lifting, as if a weight he had carried so long he'd forgotten its shape was finally shifting on his back. He picked up the deed to his father's land, the one he had kept hidden in shame for 20 years. He looked at it now with different eyes. "All this time," he said, "I thought the shame was ours to carry, but it was never ours. It was his." He looked at the long list of names on the judge's records. It was all of theirs, the Reeds, the Hollisters, the Mercers, every family that got run off in the night and called worthless after. Clara nodded slowly. "That's what my grandfather understood. He didn't gather this to punish Crow. He gathered it to give these people their names back." Elias set the deed down. Something was stirring in his chest that he had not felt in years. It took him a moment to recognize it. Hope. "We can prove it," he said. He looked at her, and for the first time his eyes were bright. "Clara, we can prove all of it, not just for my father, for every family on this list. There are folks in this valley who've spent their whole lives believing they were nothing. We could give them the truth." A smile touched Clara's mouth, but it did not last. Her face grew serious, and she leaned in close, her voice dropping low even though there was no one to hear. "We can," she said. "But you have to listen to me, Elias. Right now, this case is the only thing that can hurt Crow, and it's the only thing that can protect us." Her fingers tightened on the edge of the journal. If he ever learns this case exists, if he even suspects it survived, he will burn this whole valley to the ground before he lets it come out. No one can know. Not yet. Not a single soul. By afternoon, the sun had climbed high, drying the mud into cracked ridges across the yard. Elias worked at the kitchen table, copying the judge's notes by hand onto fresh paper. His penmanship was slow and blocky, but he pressed on. Clara had said they needed copies. If anything happened to the case, at least the truth would live somewhere else. She sat across from him, folding the copied pages into a leather satchel. Her movements were quick and sure. Every so often she glanced at the window, and Elias noticed she never sat with her back fully to the door. "You do that a lot," he said. Do what? Watch the door. Clara didn't smile. I've been running for a long time, Elias. You learn where to sit? He nodded. He understood that better than most. They had nearly finished. Elias reached for the last page, the one listing the Hollister family, when he heard it. Hoofbeats, more than one horse, coming up the long road from the valley floor. Clara froze. Her eyes met his. Get the case, she whispered. Elias moved fast. He grabbed the leather satchel and the old case both, crossed to the pantry, and shoved them behind the sacks of feed grain stacked in the corner. He piled 2 more sacks in front. His heart pounded, but his hands did the work steady and quick, the way a man's hands do when fear has become an old companion. By the time the knock came, Clara was seated at the table with a cup of coffee in her hands, calm as a still pond. Elias opened the door. 3 men stood on his porch. He knew them by sight. Crow men. The one in front was tall and lean, with a hard mouth and a hat pulled low. His name was Dawes. Behind him, the other 2 waited with their thumbs hooked in their belts near their guns. Voss, Dawes said. Afternoon. Dawes. Elias kept his voice flat. Something I can do for you? Reckon there might be. Dawes looked past him into the house. His eyes moved slow, taking in the room. Mr. Crow's had some property go missing. Old papers? Records that belonged to him. We're asking around the whole valley. Papers, Elias repeated. That's right. Dawes stepped closer. You wouldn't have seen anything come across your land, would you? Somebody passing through, maybe, in the storm. Elias felt Clara go still behind him. He did not look at her. Only thing that came across my land in that storm was rain, Elias said, and one of my fences came down by the creek. If you're offering to help mend it, I'll take it. One of the men snorted. Dawes did not laugh. Mind if we take a look around? I do mind, Elias said. This is my home. You got a paper from a judge says otherwise, you bring it. Otherwise, you can look from right there where you're standing. The porch went quiet. Dawes studied him for a long moment. Elias held his gaze and did not blink. He had faced down worse than 3 men on his own porch. He had faced down grief, and grief did not tire. Finally, Dawes gave a small nod, the kind a man gives when he plans to remember something. Suit yourself. He turned to go, then paused. He looked back, and his voice dropped lower. Word of advice, Voss. Some secrets stayed buried for a reason. A smart man leaves the ground where it lies. He touched the brim of his hat and stepped down off the porch. The 3 of them mounted up and rode out, dust curling behind their horses until they disappeared down the road. Elias shut the door. His breath came out slow. His hands were shaking now after the fact, the way they always did once the danger passed. Clara set down her coffee. Her face had gone pale. They know, she said quietly. They don't know for certain, but they know something came through here. Elias crossed to the pantry and pulled the case back out. He set it on the table between them. Then we don't have long, he said. Clara didn't answer right away. She reached for the journal and turned to the back, to the final pages, the ones neither of them had read aloud. Her fingers trembled as she opened them. There's something I have to tell you, she said. Something I've been afraid to say. Elias sat down slowly. Say it. The last pages. Clara swallowed. My grandfather wrote about a witness, a child, the only one who saw Crow's men force the families out that night with her own eyes. He hid her, changed her name to keep her safe. He spent the rest of his life protecting her. Her eyes lifted to his, wet and full of sorrow. Elias, the child was a little girl named Abigail. The room went silent. She grew up, Clara whispered. And she married you. Elias did not sleep that night. He lay on top of the covers in his clothes and stared at the ceiling, listening to the house creak and settle around him. Beside the bed, on the small table, sat Abigail's wedding ring. He had kept it there for 3 years. He had never once thought of it as a stranger's ring. Now he did not know what to think. When the first gray light came through the window, he rose. Clara was already up, sitting on the porch steps with a blanket around her shoulders. She said nothing when he stepped outside. She only looked at him with soft, careful eyes. "I have to know," he said. She nodded and followed him back inside. Abigail's things were kept in a cedar chest at the foot of the bed and in the bottom drawers of the tall dresser by the window. Elias had not opened them since the funeral. He knelt in front of the chest now, and his hands rested on the lid a long moment before he could lift it. Inside was the smell of her, cedar and dried lavender, and something underneath that was just Abigail, faint now, but still there, his throat closed up tight. "You don't have to do this alone," Clara said gently. "I've done everything else alone," he said. But he moved over to make room for her beside him. They worked through the morning. Elias lifted out folded dresses, worn soft with washing, a shawl she had knitted the winter Daniel was born, a small wooden horse Daniel had carried everywhere, tucked into the corner where she had kept it after. Elias held that horse in his big rough hands for a long time and did not say a word. Clara pretended not to notice the wet shine in his eyes. "She was the gentlest person I ever knew," Elias said finally. His voice came out cracked. "She never raised her voice. Not once in all our years. When Daniel got sick that first winter, she sat up 7 nights straight and never complained." He set the horse down careful. "How does a person carry a thing like this and stay so gentle? How does she look me in the eye every single day and never let it show?" Clara laid a hand on his arm. "Maybe she didn't carry it to hide from you. Maybe she carried it so you'd never have to." Elias shook his head slowly. "I was her husband. She should have trusted me." "She married you," Clara said. "That's the deepest trust there is." He didn't answer. He couldn't. He turned back to the chest and kept searching. It was Clara who found the dresser drawers empty of secrets and moved to the quilt folded across the trunk lid. Abigail had made it herself, a patchwork of blues and faded reds, the stitches small and even. Clara ran her fingers along the border out of habit, the way she handled every old thing, gentle and searching. She stopped. "Elias." He looked over. Her fingers had found a seam along the bottom edge that was thicker than the rest, stitched shut, then stitched over again, as if hidden on purpose. "There's something inside the lining," Clara said. Elias crossed to her. He took out his pocket knife and opened it, and his hands were steady now. "Careful." He slid the blade under the stitches, popping them one by one, until a small gap opened in the quilt's edge. Clara reached 2 fingers inside. She drew out a bundle of letters. Old ones, the paper gone soft and yellow, tied together with a faded ribbon. Elias took them from her. His breath had gone shallow. The top letter was addressed in a hand he did not know. But the name inside it, he knew all too well. "My dear Abigail." He unfolded it. Clara leaned close, and together they read in the pale morning light. "You must never blame yourself for what those men did that night. You were only a child. What you saw was not your burden to carry alone, and I will carry it with you as long as I am able. I have changed the records. No one living knows your true name but me. You're safe now. Live, child. Live and be happy. That is the only justice I can give you." It was signed at the bottom in a steady, sloping hand. Judge Thomas Whitmore. Elias sat down hard on the edge of the bed. The letters trembled in his hand. "It's true," he whispered. "All of it. She was there. She saw." Clara knelt in front of him, her own eyes wet. She was the child my grandfather saved. Elias looked down at the bundle in his hands, at the gentle words of a man who had given up everything to keep his wife safe, and something inside his chest cracked open wide. The afternoon light slanted golden across the kitchen table. Elias sat with the letters spread before him, reading each one slow, his lips moving over the words like a man learning a new language. Clara sat across from him with a cup of coffee gone cold in her hands. There were more than a dozen letters, some short, only a line or two. Others long and full of small kindnesses, all of them signed by her grandfather. He wrote to her for years, Elias said, wonder and pain mixed in his voice. Even after he vanished, look at the dates. Clara leaned in. The dates stretched across a decade. Some were written after the whole valley believed Judge Whitmore was dead and gone. He never stopped watching over her, Clara said softly. Even hidden away, he made sure she was all right. Elias picked up another letter, this one more worn than the rest, the crease deep from being folded and unfolded many times. He read it aloud. I know you are frightened, child. I know the nights are hard, but you must understand this. What you saw was true, and the truth does not become smaller because we hide it. It waits. It is patient. One day it will need a brave heart to carry it into the light. Until then, live gently. Love freely. Do not let their cruelty steal the years you have left. Elias set the letter down. His hand shook. She was just a little girl, he said. Clara nodded. Younger than Daniel was, from what my grandfather wrote. She was hiding in a hayloft the night Crow's men came. She saw them force the Harlan family off their land at gunpoint. She saw one of the men strike old Harlan when he wouldn't sign the papers. Clara's voice dropped. And she saw their faces. That was the danger. She could name them. Elias closed his eyes. He thought of Abigail humming in the kitchen, Abigail laughing when Daniel chased the chickens, Abigail's steady hands smoothing his hair back when the grief of losing his father had nearly swallowed him whole. All that time, all those quiet years, she had been carrying this. She never wanted revenge, Clara went on. She never even wanted the truth told. She just wanted a life, a husband, a son, a porch to sit on when the sun went down. Clara's eyes filled. She wanted you, Elias. That was the whole of it. She traded justice for a chance to be happy, and I think she would have made that trade 1,000 times over. Elias pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. When he lowered them, his face was wet and open in a way Clara had not seen before. I used to wonder why she never pushed me to fight Crow, he said, after my father lost everything, after we lost Daniel. I thought she was afraid. I thought she was just a gentle soul who couldn't stand conflict. He shook his head slow. She wasn't afraid of the fight. She was afraid the fight would find her, and she was right to be. He gathered the letters back into a stack, handling them like something holy. As he squared the edges, one of them slipped from the bottom and fell open on the table. This one was different. The paper was heavier, and the writing crossed the page and then turned sideways along the margins, as if the writer had run out of room and refused to stop. Elias picked it up. His brow drew together. This one's different, he said. Look at the hand. He was writing fast, scared. Clara moved around the table to read over his shoulder. Together they bent over the crowded lines. Abigail, I must tell you the truth of why I am leaving. It is not the trial I fear. Crow has learned that a witness survived that night. He does not yet know your name, but he is searching. His men have been asking in every town along the river. If I remain and continue the case, I will lead them straight to your door. So, I will vanish. I will make them believe the witness died with me. I will take their hunt onto my own back and carry it far from you. Do not grieve for me, child. A judge who cannot save the innocent is no judge at all. But a man who can trade his own name for a child's life, that man dies content. Elias could not breathe. The paper trembled between his fingers. He didn't run, he whispered. He didn't disappear to save himself. Clara's hand rose to her mouth. Tears spilled down her cheeks. He disappeared, she said, to save her. Morning came pale and quiet over the ranch. The storm had washed the valley clean, and the fields glittered with the last of the rain. Elias found Clara already at the kitchen table when he came in from the barn, the letters laid out before her in careful rows. I couldn't sleep, she said. I kept reading them over. There's a pattern I missed last night. Elias set down 2 mugs of coffee and pulled his chair close. Show me. Clara pointed to the dates penciled faint in the corners of each page. Look, every letter after he vanished came from a different town. Never the same place twice. Fort Mercer, Cold Springs, a trading post out past the river bend. Her finger moved from one to the next. He kept moving, always moving, like a man leading something away from where he wanted it to go. Elias studied the towns. He knew this country. He had ridden it as a young hand, driving cattle from one end of the valley to the other. A slow understanding spread through him. These towns, he said, they circle around Crow's land, but they never touch it. They never touch this valley. He tapped the table. He was drawing Crow's men in a wide loop. Away from here. Away from her. Clara pulled out a folded map from the case, the paper soft as cloth from age. Small marks dotted it in the same faded pencil. She spread it flat, and Elias leaned over it, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The marks made a shape, a great circle drawn town by town, year by year. And at the center of that circle, untouched, sat the little corner of the valley where Abigail had grown up, where she had married, where she had raised a boy and buried him, and loved a broken man back to living. He built a wall around her, Elias said, his voice thick, out of his own footsteps. Clara pressed the map flat with both hands. There's more. This morning I found this tucked in the lining of the case. She held up a thin sheet, official looking, the ink gone brown. It's a death notice for Judge Thomas Whitmore, signed and filed at Fort Mercer 3 years after he left. Elias took it careful. He read the words. A judge found dead on the trail, robbed by outlaws, no body recovered, only his coat and his badge. He filed his own death, Elias said slowly. He made the world believe the story, so Crow would stop looking, so the hunt would end. And it worked, Clara whispered. Once they thought the witness died with him, they stopped searching. Abigail was safe. She could finally breathe. Her eyes shone. She could finally live. Elias sat back. He looked at the map, at the letters, at the false death notice a man had written for himself so that a frightened child might grow up whole. He thought of the way the valley spoke of Judge Whitmore, a coward who ran when the fighting got hard, a man who abandoned his bench and his oath and let the wicked win. They had it all backward, every last word of it. They called him a coward, Elias said. His jaw worked. All these years, they spat his name in the saloons. Your family carried the shame of it. And the whole time, he was the bravest man this valley ever knew. Clara wiped her face with the back of her hand. He gave up everything. His name, his home, his seat on the bench. He died a stranger on some lonely road, so no one would ever come looking for a little girl in a hayloft. Elias stood. He walked to the window and looked out over the wet fields, over the barn where he had found this weeping woman dragging a case through the mud. His chest ached, but it was not the old ache. It was something sharper, something that would not let him sit still. A man traded his whole life for hers, he said, and she traded her truth for a bit of peace. And I hid in this house for years, telling myself there was nothing worth fighting for. He turned back to Clara, and his eyes were clear. They both gave everything to keep this secret quiet. But the secret was never meant to stay buried. Your grandfather said it himself. The truth waits for a brave heart to carry it into the light. He crossed to the table and laid his hand flat on the map. It's been waiting long enough, Elias said. The truth has to come out. All of it. His name, her courage, my father's honor, every family Crow ever ruined. His voice did not shake now. They died to protect this. The least I can do is have the courage to finish it. They set out the next morning under a wide blue sky. Elias hitched the wagon and Clara climbed up beside him, the leather case tucked safe beneath the seat. The road was still soft from the storm, and the horses stepped careful through the ruts. Their first stop was the old Harmon place, a low house at the far edge of the valley. Elias knew Silas Harmon from his cattle days. The man was near 80 now, his hands twisted with age, but his eyes went sharp when Elias laid the map across his kitchen table. My father lost 40 acres to Crow, Silas said. His voice cracked like dry wood. Signed papers he never understood. They told him the debt was real. He believed them. Died believing he'd failed us all. The old man traced a shaking finger along the map's edge. I got his ledger still. Kept him in a trunk. Never knew why. Guess I know now. He fetched the ledgers. Clara opened them careful, and there, in faded columns, was the proof. Payments made. Debts settled. A man who owed nothing being told? He owed everything. Can I copy these? Clara asked. The old man nodded slow. Take 'em. Take all of it. Just tell folks my father was honest. His chin trembled. That's all I ever wanted anybody to know. They traveled on. Farm to farm, house to house, they gathered the scattered pieces of a truth that had waited decades in trunks and drawers and quiet hearts. At the Delgado Ranch, a widow brought out a photograph of her husband's father, a proud man standing before land he had cleared with his own hands. Land Crow took. At the Byrne homestead, 3 brothers spoke over one another, each remembering a different piece of the same old wound. Word spread ahead of them. By the second day, folks were waiting at their gates when the wagon came into view. Some had documents, some had only stories, passed down like keepsakes, but every story fit against the judge's evidence like a key into a lock. Clara wrote it all down, page after page, name after name. Her hand grew tired, but she did not stop. It's like a quilt, she said that evening, leaning against the wagon wheel while the horses grazed. Every family holds one square. Alone, it's just a scrap of cloth. But when you sew them together, you see the whole picture, Elias finished. She smiled at him, weary and glad. At the Fletcher place, an old woman named Ruth sat them down and held Clara's hand in both of hers. I remember your grandfather, Ruth said softly. He came to our door once before all the trouble. Kind man. Listened like your words mattered. Her eyes went misty. When they said he ran, I never believed it. Not in my heart. A man like that doesn't run. She squeezed Clara's fingers. You tell me he was brave, and I'd say I knew it all along. Clara could not speak. She only nodded, tears sliding free. Something was changing in the valley. Elias felt it as they rode. It was small at first, no louder than a whisper. But it grew. In the way folks stood a little straighter when they spoke their fathers' names. In the way old shame lifted off their shoulders like fog burning away in morning sun. On the second evening, they stopped at the little chapel near the crossroads. A dozen families had gathered there, drawn by the news traveling farm to farm. They filled the wooden pews, hats in their hands, faces turned toward Elias and Clara at the front. Elias stood before them. He was no speaker. His whole life he had let silence do his talking. But he looked out at those tired, hopeful faces and the words came. Your people weren't failures, he said. They were robbed, every one of them, and there's a man who died proving it. He rested his hand on the case. We got the truth now, all of it, and I mean to see it stand up in the light where it belongs. A murmur moved through the room. An old man near the back rose slowly to his feet. Then, I reckon, he said, his voice trembling, it's about time somebody listened. Around him, one by one, the others began to stand. The barn had stood locked for years. Elias had built it with his own hands, back when the world still held promise. He and Abigail had raised the beams together. Little Daniel had run through the sawdust, laughing, chasing the barn cats. After they were gone, Elias could not bear to step inside. He had nailed the doors shut and let the dust settle over everything he could not touch. Now he pried those nails loose one cold morning. The doors groaned open. Light spilled across the dirt floor for the first time in a decade. Elias stood in the doorway a long moment, his heart pounding like a drum. The old smell hit him. Hay and leather and pine. It smelled like the man he used to be. Clara appeared beside him, a broom in her hands. You sure about this? She asked, gentle. Elias breathed deep. No, he said, but I'm doing it anyway. They worked all morning. They swept out the cobwebs and cleared the old tools. They carried in benches from the church and set them in rows. Clara found a table for the case and the ledgers and the growing stack of papers. By noon, the barn looked like a place where living happened again. Word had gone out. That afternoon, the families came. They came in wagons and on foot. They came in their Sunday clothes, though it was only Tuesday. Old Silas Harmon arrived first, his son steadying his elbow up the path. Then the Delgado widow. Then the Byrne brothers and Ruth Fletcher, and dozens more Elias knew only by the sorrow they carried. They gathered inside the barn where his son had once played. Elias watched from the corner, unsure. He half expected the walls to close in on him, to drown him in memory. But something else happened instead. The barn filled with voices. An old rancher stood and told about the day Crow's men came to his father's door. A young mother spoke of the grandmother she never got to know, run off her land before the child was born. Story after story rose up into the rafters. Some folks wept as they spoke. Others laughed through their tears, remembering happier days before the trouble came. And the strangest thing of all happened as Elias listened. The barn did not feel like a grave anymore. It felt like a heart, beating again. Ruth Fletcher rose and told about Judge Whitmore, how he had once fixed her family's roof himself in the rain, asking nothing in return. Clara sat with her pen still, too moved to write, tears shining on her cheeks. When Ruth finished, she reached out and took Clara's hand, and the whole room grew quiet with respect for a man they had misjudged for 20 long years. Somebody brought food? Somebody always did. Bread and stew and pies laid out on a plank table. Children ran between the benches, chasing each other the way Daniel once had. Elias watched them and felt the old ache. But it was different now, softer, like a bruise that was finally starting to heal. As the sun sank low, the barn glowed warm with lantern light. The families lingered. Nobody seemed to want to leave. They stood in little knots, talking low, hands on each other's shoulders. Neighbors who had spent years too ashamed to meet each other's eyes now spoke like family. Elias stepped outside for air. He leaned against the barn wall and looked up at the first stars pricking through the dusk. Behind him, through the open doors, the sound of many voices drifted out into the cool evening. Laughter, a child's shout, an old woman's song, half remembered, joined by others one by one. Something moved in his chest that he had not felt in years. He searched for the name of it. It took him a moment. Hope. It was small, fragile, but it was real, and it was growing, spreading through him like the light spilling from those open doors. Clara came and stood beside him. She followed his gaze back toward the barn, toward the warmth and the people and the sound of a community stitching itself whole again. "You did this," she said softly. Elias shook his head, watching them. "No," he said. "We all did." The morning came bright and clear. Elias was in the corral, brushing down the mare when he heard the hoofbeats. Not the easy clop of a neighbor coming to call. These were sharp, fast, the sound of men who wanted to be seen coming. He looked up. A fine black carriage rolled up the lane, pulled by two matched horses that had never known a hard day's work. Two riders flanked it. Men Elias recognized. Crow's men. Their hands rested easy near their belts, the way men do when they mean for you to notice. The carriage stopped. The door opened. Silas Crow stepped down. He was a tall man, silver at the temples, dressed in a coat that cost more than Elias made in a season. He moved slow and certain, the way a man moves when he owns the ground beneath his feet. He looked around the ranch with a small smile, as if he were pricing it in his head. "Mr. Voss," Crow said. His voice was smooth as riverstone. "Fine morning." Elias set the brush down on the fence rail. He did not come closer. "It was," he said. Crow chuckled, low and warm, like they were old friends sharing a joke. He walked toward the corral, taking his time. His boots barely gathered dust. "I hear you had quite a gathering out here yesterday," Crow said. "The whole valley near about? Folks telling stories, sharing their troubles." He shook his head slow. "Sad thing, all that old pain. A man hates to see it stirred up again." "Some pain needs stirring," Elias said. "Otherwise, it just sits and rots." Crow stopped at the fence. He rested one gloved hand on the rail, close to where Elias stood. Up close, his eyes were pale and cold, though his mouth still smiled. "Elias," he said, softer now, using the first name like a blade. "May I call you Elias? I knew your father. Good man. Worked himself to the bone on land that fought him every step. Broke my heart what happened to him." Elias's jaw tightened. "You know what happened to him?" "I know a lot of things." Crow's smile did not move. "That's why I came. See, I'm a practical man. I don't like waste, and you, my friend, are about to waste your life on ghosts." He reached into his coat. Elias's hand drifted toward his own belt, but Crow only drew out a folded paper. He held it out over the rail. "A note from the bank," Crow said. "Your debts, all of them, paid in full the moment you say the word. Your ranch is failing, Elias. We both know it. This puts you on solid ground. New cattle, new fences, a fresh start." He let the words hang. "And my protection. Nobody troubles a man under my wing. Nobody." Elias looked at the paper. It was a lot of money, enough to save everything he had, enough to stop lying awake at night, doing sums in the dark. He did not take it. "And in return?" Elias asked, though he already knew. "You let the past stay buried." Crow shrugged. "Easy. Burn those old papers. Send that Whitmore girl on her way. Tell your neighbors the storm's past, and it's time to get back to work." He smiled wider. "That's all. Just quiet. Everybody goes home happy." Elias was quiet a long moment. He thought of the barn last night, the lantern light, Ruth Fletcher's hand in Clara's, the children running, the song rising up into the rafters where his boy once played. He thought of Abigail. "Put your paper away, Mr. Crow," Elias said. The smile flickered. "Now think careful, son. I've done all my thinking." Elias's voice was low and steady. "Those folks in my barn yesterday, they spent 20 years believing they were failures, believing the shame was theirs. It wasn't. It was yours. And I'm not going to take your money to sew their mouths shut." For a moment, Crow said nothing. The warmth drained out of his face like water from a cracked cup. What was left was hard and flat and old. He folded the paper and slid it back into his coat. "You disappoint me," Crow said quietly. "I offered you a kindness. Remember that." He stepped back from the rail, straightening his gloves. "Men like me built this valley, Voss. We don't get torn down by grieving cowboys and dead judges' granddaughters. Powerful men have secrets, and powerful men destroy anyone foolish enough to dig them up." He turned toward his carriage. "You've got a warm little barn full of people who trust you," Crow said, not looking back. "I'd think hard on what a man stands to lose." The county seat sat 2 hours' ride to the east, where the valley opened out into flatter land and the buildings turned from timber to brick. Elias had not been to town in years. He'd forgotten how much it pressed on a man, all those windows and faces, and the rattle of wagons on hard-packed streets. He rode beside Clara in the wagon, the leather case wrapped in oilcloth beneath the bench seat. Not the real one. That stayed hidden back at the ranch. This was copies, page for page, the words traced out careful by lantern light over 3 long nights. If Crow's men came for it on the road, they'd steal nothing that couldn't be made again. Clara sat straight, her hands folded in her lap, but Elias saw how her knuckles had gone white. "You all right?" he asked. "My grandfather walked these streets," she said quietly. "He wore a badge here. Men tipped their hats to him." She swallowed. "And then they called him a coward for the rest of his life? A man who ran." Elias flicked the reins. "We're gonna fix that." She looked at him then, and something in her face steadied. "Yes," she said, "we are." The courthouse rose up at the end of the main street, a wide stone building with tall white columns and a set of steps that seemed built to make a person feel small. Elias tied the horses and lifted the wrapped case out from under the seat. It felt heavier than it should have. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of ink and old paper. Their boots echoed on the marble floor. A clerk led them to a set of double doors, and beyond them lay the hearing room. Rows of wooden benches, a raised platform where the judge would sit, high windows letting in bars of pale morning light. The room was already half full. Word had traveled. Some of the Valley families had come, dressed in their Sunday best, sitting stiff and hopeful on the hard benches. Ruth Fletcher was there, her chin lifted. Old Tom Barrow. The Hendersons. Faces that had gathered in Elias's barn only 2 days before, singing in the lantern light. And on the other side of the room sat 3 men in fine dark suits. Crow's lawyers. They had leather satchels and neat stacks of paper, and the calm, easy look of men who had never lost anything they cared to keep. Crow himself was not there. He didn't need to be. Elias and Clara took their seats at a small table near the front. Clara laid out the copied letters, the journal pages, the traced land records. Her hands moved careful and sure. The presiding official entered, a gray-haired man named Ambrose, and the room rose and settled. He shuffled his papers and peered down over his spectacles. "We're here," he said, "to consider a request to reopen an inquiry into land transfers dated some 20 years past, and matters connected to the disappearance of Judge Thomas Whitmore." He set his glasses lower. "Miss Whitmore, you may present." Clara stood. Her voice shook at first, then found its feet. She spoke of her grandfather's journal, of the letters between him and settlers who lost everything, of forged agreements and altered records. She held up each page and named the family it belonged to, and one by one those families sat a little taller. When she finished, the room was silent. Then the lead lawyer stood. He was a smooth-faced man with oiled hair, and he smiled the same smile Elias had seen on Crow. "Sir," he said, turning to Ambrose, "these documents are lovely, truly, but they are copies of copies, perhaps. Where are the originals?" He spread his hands. Anyone with a pen and an afternoon could produce such things. They exist, Clara said. So you say. The lawyer turned, slow, and pointed a finger at Elias. And who brings them forward? Not a lawman, not a scholar. This man. His voice sharpened. Elias Voss, whose father held a bitter grudge against Mr. Crow, whose family lost a cattle dispute years ago and never forgave it. He shook his head sadly. This isn't justice, sir. This is a grieving man's revenge, dressed up in an old judge's clothes. The words hung in the air. Elias felt them land one by one like stones. He looked around the room. He saw Ruth Fletcher's face fall. He saw old Tom Barrow's hands tighten on his knees. He saw the hope draining out of people who had waited 20 years to feel it. And something rose up in him. Not anger, something quieter and stronger than that. Elias stood. You're right, he said. The lawyer blinked. He hadn't expected that. I did hate Silas Crow, Elias went on. His voice was low, but it carried. For years I believed my father was a fool, a man who couldn't keep his land. I carried that shame like a saddle sore that never healed. He paused. I'm not standing here for revenge. I'm standing here because I finally learned the truth. And so did everyone in this room who lost something they never got back. He turned to the families. You don't have to take my word, he said. You don't have to take the copies. Take theirs. Ruth Fletcher rose first. She was a small woman, gray and bent, but she stood like a fence post driven deep. My husband signed a paper he couldn't read, she said. A man from the Crow Ranch stood over him while he did it, told him it was a loan. 6 months later, they took our house. My Samuel died believing he'd failed us. Her voice cracked. He didn't fail us. They cheated him. Old Tom Barrow stood next. Then the Hendersons. One after another, they rose from the hard benches and spoke. Different names, different years, but the same story told over and over. A stranger with papers, a signature, a threat spoken soft so no one else could hear. And then everything gone. The lawyer tried to break in. This is hearsay, emotion, not evidence. But Ambrose lifted a hand. Let them speak, he said. So they spoke. And when the last voice fell quiet, Clara stood again. She held up the journal, its cover worn soft by years and weather. My grandfather wrote down every name, she said. Every date, every parcel of stolen land. She opened it to a marked page. He wrote, The men who stole this land do not fear the law. They own the law. He knew what would happen to him if he stayed, so he hid the truth where it would keep, and he waited for someone brave enough to carry it forward. She looked at the families, then at Elias. He's not a coward, she said. He gave his whole life so this day could come. Then Elias reached into his coat and drew out one last thing. A letter folded and creased, Abigail's hand across the front. My wife saw it happen, he said. She was a child. She watched Crow's men force a family off their land at gunpoint. Judge Whitmore hid her to keep her alive. She carried that secret to her grave to protect the people she loved. His throat tightened. She wrote these words before she passed. The world doesn't need another man who knows how to fight. It needs a man who remembers why fighting matters. He set the letter on the table. I'm remembering, he said. That's all this is. The room was still. So still Elias could hear the pale morning wind against the high windows. Ambrose took off his spectacles. He rubbed his eyes, slow like a man waking from a long sleep. He looked at the copies. He looked at the journal. He looked at the faces filling the benches, one after another, honest and open and unafraid. In 30 years on this bench, he said quietly, I have learned that the truth has a weight all its own, copies or not. I know it when I feel it. He set his glasses down. "I find sufficient cause to reopen this inquiry. The land transfers will be reviewed. The name of Judge Thomas Whitmore is entered into this record as a man of honor." For a moment, no one moved. Then Ruth Fletcher began to cry, and someone let out a shout, and the whole room rose to its feet at once. The families reached for each other. Strangers grabbed hands. Old Tom Barrow laughed like a boy. Clara turned to Elias, tears shining on her face. "You did it," she whispered. "We did," he said. The drive back to the ranch felt different than any drive Elias could remember. The truck rattled over the old dirt road, same as it always had. The fences leaned the same way. The hills sat dark against the last light. But something inside Elias had shifted, like a heavy door swinging open after years stuck shut. Clara sat beside him with the leather case on her lap. Her hands rested on top of it, gentle, the way a person might rest a hand on a sleeping child. "I keep thinking about him," she said. "My grandfather. All those years he stayed hidden. I used to be so angry at him." She looked out the window. "I thought he ran. I thought he left us to carry his shame." "He carried more than any of us knew," Elias said. "He did." A small smile touched her lips. "And now the whole valley knows it too." Elias pulled up in front of the barn. The sky had gone the color of ashes, soft and gray, and the first stars were poking through. He shut off the engine. For a while, neither of them moved. "Feels strange," he said finally. "Being done." "We're not done," Clara said. "The land still has to be reviewed. There's paperwork, hearings." "I know." Elias rubbed the back of his neck. "But the hard part, the part where nobody believed us, that's behind us now." They carried the case into the barn together. Elias had spent weeks fixing the old place up. New boards where the wind had torn through. A fresh coat of oil on the big door, hinges so they no longer screamed. He had swept out years of dust and hung a lantern by the workbench. The barn that once held only ghosts now smelled of clean hay and pine. He knelt by the far wall where a loose plank hid a small space between the boards. He had built it years ago to keep his rifle safe from the damp. Now he tucked the leather case inside, wrapped in an old wool blanket, and set the plank back in place. "Nobody will find it there," he said. Clara ran her hand along the wall. "It'll be safe till morning?" "Safe as anything." Elias stood and brushed the straw from his knees. "Tomorrow we take it to Ambrose's office. Let him lock it up proper. Then it's out of our hands for good." Clara let out a long breath. Her shoulders dropped like she was setting down a weight she'd carried far too long. "My grandfather would have liked you," she said quietly. Elias didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded, and something warm moved through his chest, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. They stood together in the lantern light a moment longer. Then they blew it out and walked to the house through the cool night air. Elias slept better that night than he had in years. Morning came pale and quiet. Elias rose before the sun, the way he always did, and pulled on his boots. He made coffee. He watched the light creep gray across the hills. And then he walked out to the barn to fetch the case. The big door hung open. Elias stopped cold. He had shut that door the night before. He remembered the smooth swing of the oiled hinges. He remembered latching it. But now it hung crooked. The latch splintered clean off, hanging by a single bent nail. His heart began to pound. He crossed the yard in long strides and stepped inside. The barn was torn apart. His tools lay scattered. The workbench was tipped on its side, and the loose plank in the far wall had been ripped away and thrown across the floor. The space behind it was empty. Elias dropped to his knees. He reached into the hole, feeling along the cold boards, hoping, praying his fingers would find the wool blanket. They found nothing but dust and dark. The case was gone. "No," he whispered. "No, no." Bootprints marked the dirt floor. More than one man. They led out the back, where the fence had been cut and folded down. By the time Elias reached town, the news had already spread. Silas Crow stood on the steps of the general store, dressed clean, his hat in his hand, speaking to a crowd of gathered men. "There never was any case," Crow said, his voice smooth as riverstone. "A grieving man invented a story to punish the family that once bested his father. I feel nothing but pity for him, but pity is not proof." He smiled, wide and easy. "Show me this famous case," he said. "Go on. Ask Elias Voss to show you what he swears he had." The barn felt like a grave. Elias sat on the overturned workbench, his elbows on his knees, staring at the hole in the far wall. The empty hole, the one that had held everything, every letter, every page his wife had hidden, every truth that could have set the dead to rest, gone. The morning light came through the broken door in a thin gray line. It fell across the scattered tools, across the ripped plank lying in the dirt, across his own worn hands. He turned those hands over slowly, like he might find some answer written there. He found only calluses and dust. He had been so sure. He had checked that latch twice. He had believed the barn could keep something safe. Same as he had once believed a man could keep his family safe. Same as he had believed all those years ago that if he just kept his head down and worked hard, the world would leave him be. He had been wrong every single time. Elias let out a slow, shaking breath. In town, Silas Crow was standing on those store steps right now, smiling that easy smile, telling the whole valley that Elias Voss was nothing but a bitter, grieving fool. And the worst part, the part that dug into him like a rusted nail, was that folks would believe it, because there was nothing left to show them. No case, no letters, no proof. His father's name would stay in the mud where Crow had buried it, right beside all the others. He thought of Abigail. He thought of the quiet way she used to move through this ranch, humming to herself, carrying a secret so heavy it should have crushed her. She had trusted the truth to come out someday. She had trusted him to carry it, and he had let it slip through his fingers in a single night. The sound of soft footsteps made him lift his head. Clara stood in the broken doorway. She had a coat over her arm and a small bag in her hand. Her eyes were red, like she hadn't slept, and when she looked at the ripped plank and the empty wall, her whole face seemed to fall in on itself. "I heard him," she said. "In town. Word travels fast around here." Elias said nothing. He didn't have the words. Clara stepped inside. She set her bag down by the door, careful, like the floor itself might break. For a long moment she just looked at the ruin of the barn he had worked so hard to fix. "I did this," she whispered. "Clara." "No." She shook her head hard. "I brought that case to your door. I dragged it through the storm and I put it in your hands and I told myself I was protecting it. But all I did was paint a mark on your back." Her voice cracked. "Crow's men were here, Elias, in your barn. They cut your fence. They could have hurt you. They could have killed you, and it would have been my doing." Elias looked at the floor. Part of him wanted to stand up and tell her none of it was her fault, that she had been brave, that her grandfather would be proud, but he was so tired, the kind of tired that lived deep in the bones that no sleep could touch. And underneath the tired was a cold, familiar voice he thought he had silenced, the same voice that had whispered to him after Abigail, after Daniel. "Every time you stand up, someone gets hurt. Maybe some battles are too old to win," he said quietly. Clara flinched as if he had struck her. She picked her bag back up. Her hands were trembling. "Then I won't stay and make yours any harder," she said. "You've lost enough because of my family. I won't let you lose more." She waited. Elias felt it, that pause hanging in the air between them. She was waiting for him to say something, to ask her to stay, to tell her they would find another way. He kept his eyes on the empty hole in the wall. He said nothing. Clara nodded once, slow, like something inside her had finally gone quiet too. Then she turned and walked out through the broken door, into the pale morning light, and Elias did not stop her. The afternoon sun had climbed high and cold by the time Elias came back to the barn. He had not planned to. He had spent hours walking the fence line, checking the cattle, doing the small chores that kept his hands busy and his mind quiet. But his feet had carried him back here anyway, the way they always did. Back to the place that held his son's laughter in its walls. Back to the empty hole where the truth used to be. He stood in the doorway a long time. The barn looked wounded. The ripped plank still lay in the dirt where Crow's men had thrown it. The far wall gaped open, dark and hollow. Elias thought about leaving it that way, letting it fall down board by board until the whole thing sank back into the earth. But he couldn't do it. His hands wouldn't let him. So he fetched his tools. He knelt by the broken wall and he began to work. It was slow going. His hammer felt heavy. Each nail took more out of him than it should have. But there was something steadying in the rhythm of it. The tap, tap, tap. The smell of sawdust. The old wood groaning as he fit it back into place. For a little while, he did not have to think about Clara walking away, or Crow smiling on those store steps, or the cold voice in his chest that kept whispering he had failed. He just worked. He reached for one of the low beams, the thick oak one that ran along the base of the wall. It had come loose in the break, and he pressed his shoulder against it to push it back true. That was when he felt it. The beam moved wrong. Not the heavy shift of solid wood, but a lighter slide, like something hollow. Elias frowned. He ran his fingers along the underside, feeling the grain, and there, near the joint, he found a thin seam, a line too straight to be natural. His heart began to beat faster. He worked his knife blade into the seam. The wood gave a soft click, and a small panel swung loose in his hand. Behind it was a hollow space, no bigger than a bread box, carved careful and clean into the beam. Elias went very still. He knew this work. He knew the neat, patient way the corners had been cut. He had watched those same hands sew quilts by the fire and mend his shirts and cup Daniel's small face at night. This was Abigail's work. She had done this. She had knelt right here in this barn and hidden something where no one would ever think to look. His throat went tight. Inside the hollow lay a single folded paper wrapped in a scrap of blue cloth. He recognized the cloth. It was a piece of her Sunday dress, the one she had worn the day they married. His hands shook as he lifted it out. He sat back against the wall, right there in the sawdust and the dust and the broken light, and he unfolded the letter. Her handwriting rose up to meet him, small and careful, and so familiar it hurt. "My dearest Elias," it read, "if you are reading this, then you have found the place I made. I always hoped you would. Not soon. Not while I could still hold your hand. But someday, when the time was right and you were ready. I have carried something heavy my whole life, love. You know that now, or you will soon. I never told you, and I need you to understand it was not because I did not trust you. It was because I trusted you too much. You would have picked up my burden and carried it yourself, and I could not let it break you the way it nearly broke me. But I always knew this day would come. I knew the truth would not stay buried forever. And I knew that when it rose up, you would be the one standing over it. I know you, Elias Voss, better than you know yourself. You think you are a man who has run out of fight, but I have seen the fire in you. I saw it the day you stood between Daniel and that storm. I have always believed you would one day find the courage to finish what others were too afraid to start. Elias read the rest of the letter by lamplight that night, and again with the first gray light of morning. He read it until the words felt like they lived inside his own chest. "The world doesn't need another man who knows how to fight," she had written near the end. "It needs a man who remembers why fighting matters. And there is more, my love. I did not leave you with only my words. I left you with proof. I made copies. I hid them the way my heart taught me to, in the places we made together. Look where we lived. Look where we loved. You will know them when you find them." Elias sat up straight. Copies. She had made copies of the evidence, years ago, alone, telling no one. While he had slept beside her thinking he knew her whole heart, she had been building a wall of truth that even Crow could not tear down. He rose before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. He did not stop to eat. He carried the letter in his shirt pocket, close to his skin, and he began to search. The places we made together. He started in the house. He pried up the loose board by the hearth, where they had once hidden Daniel's Christmas gifts. Nothing but dust, and a child's forgotten marble. He searched the kitchen, running his hands along the underside of the shelves she had sanded smooth with her own arms. He checked the window seat she had loved, the one that looked out over the eastern field. By mid-morning, he had found nothing, and his hope was thinning like frost in the sun. He was on his knees in the bedroom, feeling behind the headboard, when he heard hooves in the yard. He went to the door. Clara sat on a borrowed mare, her face pale and set, her chin lifted like she was daring him to send her away. "I couldn't do it," she said before he could speak. "I told myself I'd leave the valley. I got as far as the crossing." She swallowed. "But my grandfather didn't give his whole life so I could ride off when it got hard, and neither did your wife." She looked at him steady. "You still need help, Elias, and I'm not going anywhere." Something in his chest loosened. He had not known how heavy the loneliness had grown until it lifted. "Then get down off that horse," he said quietly. "There's work to do." He showed her the letter. She read it with tears standing in her eyes, and when she finished, she pressed it back into his hands like it was made of glass. "The places you made together," she repeated softly. "Where did you two build something? With your own hands?" Elias thought. And then, slow as sunrise, he understood. "The garden," he said. "She planted a rose garden the spring after we married. Said every home needed something that came back to life every year." His voice cracked. "I've let it go wild since she passed. Couldn't bear to look at it." They went together, out past the well to the tangle of thorns and gray stems that had once been Abigail's pride. In the center stood an old stone marker she had set herself, flat and square, half swallowed now by weeds. Elias knelt and pushed the dirt away. Beneath the stone the soil was packed tight, but his fingers found the edge of something. Metal. A tin box, sealed with wax, buried deep enough that no storm and no thief could ever have known it was there. His hands trembled as he lifted it free. Clara crouched beside him, hardly breathing. He worked the lid loose. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, lay a thick stack of papers. Land records, copies of the judge's letters, penned in Abigail's own careful hand. The forged agreements laid bare beside the true ones. Names. Dates. Everything Crow had stolen from the beam in the barn. Everything he thought he had destroyed. Elias let out a breath that shook his whole body. He looked at the papers, and then at Clara, and for the first time in a long, long while, he felt his mouth pull into something close to a smile. He didn't win, Elias said. She was 3 steps ahead of him. All this time. Clara laughed through her tears. The truth's still alive. Elias pressed the tin box to his chest and closed his eyes. "Yes," he whispered. "It is." Word spread the way fire spreads through dry grass. Quiet at first, then all at once. Elias did not shout it from the church steps. That was not his way. Instead, he saddled his horse the next morning and rode from ranch to ranch, farm to farm, knocking on doors that had stayed shut to him for years. The tin box rode with him, wrapped tight and hidden in his saddlebag. But it was not the box that opened those doors. It was the look in his eyes. The first house was the Harlan place, out past the dry creek. Old Ben Harlan came to the door with his shotgun half raised, the way a man does when he has learned to trust nobody. Elias stood in the yard with his hat in his hands. "I know what folks say about my family," Elias said. "Same as they say about yours, that we failed, that we couldn't hold what was ours." He paused. "It was a lie, Ben. Crow took it. He took it from all of us, and I can prove it now." The shotgun lowered, inch by inch. Ben Harlan's weathered face crumpled like a piece of old paper. "My father died believing he wasn't man enough," Ben whispered. "Died ashamed." "He wasn't a failure," Elias said gently. "He was robbed, and it's time the whole valley knew it." Ben Harlan wept right there on his own porch, a grown man with gray in his beard, weeping like a boy. Then he wiped his face, set his jaw, and said the words Elias would hear again and again over the coming days. "I'll testify, whatever it takes. I'll stand up and say it." Clara rode the other roads while Elias rode his. She was gentler in her way, sitting at kitchen tables, sharing tea, showing families the copied letters in her grandfather's hand. She told them about Judge Whitmore, about how he had given up his good name to save a child, about how that child had grown up to be Elias's own wife, and how she had spent her last years quietly guarding the truth so that this very day could come. "My grandfather believed in you," Clara told a room full of frightened widows in the Delgado kitchen. "He believed the day would come when the valley would be ready to stand together." He was right. Weren't he? One by one, they nodded. By the fourth day, the old barn on Elias's ranch was no longer empty. They came at dusk, wagon after wagon rolling up the muddy lane. Families Elias had not spoken to in a decade. Ranch hands who had bowed their heads to Crow for years, too scared to lift them. Mothers with children on their hips. Old men leaning on canes. They filed into the barn where Elias had once raised his boy, and where he had thought he would never again find anything but grief. Elias stood on a hay bale at the front, the lamplight flickering across the sea of faces. His throat felt tight. For so long he had believed that standing up only got innocent people hurt. He had carried that fear like a stone in his chest since the day he buried his wife and son. But looking out at these people, he understood something Abigail had known all along. He was not asking them to fight his battle. He was asking them to reclaim their own. "I can't promise you it'll be easy," Elias said, his voice rough. "Crow is powerful. He'll lie. He'll threaten. He'll try to make us doubt ourselves the way he always has." He swallowed hard. "But the truth is buried no longer. My wife saw to that, and I'm done being afraid." A silence hung over the barn. Then Ben Harlan rose to his feet. "I stand with you, Voss." Widow Delgado stood next. "And you." Then another. And another. Until the whole barn was on its feet, a wall of people rising like a tide, their voices filling the rafters where only silence and sorrow had lived for years. Elias looked out at them, his eyes stinging, and felt the last of his loneliness fall away like a coat he no longer needed to wear. He was not fighting alone. The whole valley stood behind him now. The courthouse in Ridgeline had not seen a crowd like this in 20 years. They came from every corner of the valley. They filled the wooden benches until there was no room left, and then they stood along the walls, shoulder to shoulder, hats clutched in rough hands. Some had brought their children. Some had brought the photographs of loved ones long dead, holding them against their chests like shields. Outside, the ones who could not fit crowded the steps and pressed their faces to the tall windows. Elias sat at the front, Clara beside him. The tin box rested on the table before them, its lid closed, but its secrets ready. Then the door opened, and Silas Crow walked in. He wore a fine black coat and a silver watch chain that caught the morning light. He moved slow and easy, nodding to the men he owned, smiling at the judge like they were old friends. His boots did not hurry. Why would they? Silas Crow had never lost a fight in this valley in his life. He took his seat and leaned back, one arm draped over the chair like a man waiting for supper. When his eyes found Elias, they held no fear at all, only amusement. "You've stirred up quite a crowd, Voss," he said quietly, so only Elias could hear. "Pity it won't matter. Folks talk, papers get lost, and a grieving man looking for someone to blame? That's an easy story to tell." Elias did not answer. He only looked at him, steady and calm, the way a man looks at a storm he has finally stopped fearing. The judge banged his gavel. The room fell silent. "We're here," the judge said, "to hear testimony regarding the land claims of this valley and the conduct of Mr. Silas Crow. Who speaks first?" Clara rose. She spoke first of her grandfather. She held up his journal and read his own words aloud, her voice clear and unshaking. "The men who stole this land do not fear the law. They own the law." She told the room how Judge Thomas Whitmore had vanished, not as a coward, but as a protector, how he had given up his name and his freedom to shield an innocent child. Then she read the forged land records into the record, one after another. The false signatures, the threats hidden inside polite letters, the pattern that ran like a black thread through 20 years of stolen homes. Crow's smile stayed fixed, but it had gone stiff at the corners. Then Ben Harlan stood. He was not a man of pretty words, but he did not need them. He gripped the rail with both hands, and his voice broke as he spoke. "My father worked that land 40 years. Then Crow's men came one night with lit torches and papers he never signed. Told him the debt was called. My father lost everything. Died 3 winters later, ashamed, thinking he'd failed us." Ben looked straight at Crow. "He didn't fail. You robbed him, and you let him die believing the lie." A murmur rolled through the courtroom like distant thunder. Then Widow Delgado stood. She told of her husband, driven off his ranch, broken by the shame of it. Then a rancher from the North Hills. Then an old ranch hand who had once ridden for Crow himself, his hands trembling as he confessed the things he had been ordered to do. One by one they came forward. The families who had whispered for decades finally spoke aloud. Voices that had been silenced by fear and money and time rose up in that room until the very walls seemed to lean in to listen. Each story added to the last, stacking higher and higher, until the shape of the thing could no longer be denied. This was no accident, no string of bad luck, no collection of failed men. This was theft, deliberate, cruel, and vast. The judge's face had gone pale. He looked down at the mountain of letters and records spread across his bench, then out at the sea of grieving, hopeful faces filling every inch of his courtroom. And Silas Crow, for the first time in 20 years, was no longer smiling. He sat rigid in his fine black coat, his knuckles white against the armrest, watching the truth he had buried so long ago rise up before the whole valley at last. The morning came gray and cool, with a thin mist hanging low over the valley. But the people came anyway. They filled the courthouse again, packing the benches and lining the walls, and this time there was something different in the air. Not just fear, not just grief. Hope had crept in overnight, quiet as sunrise. Elias stood near the back with Clara at his side. He had not slept. Every hour of the long night he had lain awake, listening to the wind against the old barn, thinking of Abigail, thinking of his father, thinking of all the men and women who had waited far longer than one sleepless night for this day to come. The judge entered, the room went still. He was an older man, with tired eyes and a face carved by years of hard decisions. He set his papers down and looked out over the crowd for a long moment before he spoke. When he did, his voice was low and steady. "I have spent the night reviewing the evidence brought before this court," he began. "The letters, the journal of Judge Thomas Whitmore, the land records, the testimony of dozens of men and women who came forward yesterday to speak the truth." He paused. The room held its breath. "It is the finding of this court that the land claims filed by Silas Crow over the past 20 years were obtained through fraud, forgery, and threat. Those claims are hereby overturned. The land stolen from the families of this valley will be returned to its rightful owners or their heirs." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the courtroom broke open like a dam. A sound rose up that Elias had never heard before. It was not cheering, not exactly. It was something deeper. Men who had carried shame on their backs for 20 years wept openly, unashamed. Women clutched the old photographs to their chests and pressed their lips to the faces of the dead. Ben Harlan buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking, and an old rancher beside him gripped his neck and held him steady. The judge banged his gavel, but he did not seem eager to quiet them. He let the room roar for a while, and Elias thought he saw the old man's own eyes shining. "Furthermore," the judge went on when the noise finally settled, "the conduct of Mr. Silas Crow will be referred for full criminal prosecution. The reputation this valley granted him was built on the ruin of honest people. This court will not protect it any longer." Every eye turned to Crow. He sat alone now. The men he had owned had drifted away from him during the night, the way rats leave a ship they know is sinking. His fine black coat looked too big for him suddenly. His silver watch chain no longer caught any light. He stared straight ahead at nothing, his jaw tight, a man watching the empire he built crumble to dust before the whole valley he had spent his life fooling. Elias watched him too, and he waited for the anger to rise. For years he had imagined this moment, imagined the satisfaction of seeing Crow brought low. He had thought it would feel like winning, but it did not. Looking at Crow, Elias felt only a strange, quiet emptiness. The man had lost everything, and it changed nothing. It did not bring back Elias's father. It did not bring back Abigail or Daniel. Crow's ruin was just an ending. It healed no one. So Elias turned away from him. He turned instead toward the people, toward Ben Harlan, wiping his eyes and laughing at the same time, toward Widow Delgado, holding her husband's photograph up so it could see the room, whispering something Elias could not hear but understood all the same, toward the old ranch hand who had confessed his sins, now surrounded by the very families he had wronged, all of them holding on to him, forgiving him, lifting him up. That was where the justice lived, not in Crow's fallen face, in these. Elias felt Clara's hand find his arm, and he looked down at her. There were tears on her cheeks, but she was smiling. "He would have been proud," she said softly. "My grandfather. He'd have loved to see this." Elias nodded. His throat felt tight. All this time he had believed justice meant standing over a fallen enemy. He had been wrong. Justice was this: people standing up straight again, people remembering they had never been failures at all, people taking back their names and their dignity and their place in a valley that had forgotten to see them. It was not about tearing a man down. It was about lifting the forgotten back up. Spring came soft to the valley that year. The snow melted off the high ridges and ran down in bright little streams, feeding the grass until the whole world turned green. Elias stood on his porch one morning with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, and he watched the light move across the land, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the sight of his own ranch did not make his chest ache. It made him hopeful. The barn was the first thing anyone saw now when they came up the road. The old wood that had stood gray and sagging for so many years was gone. In its place rose fresh timber, honey-colored and strong, raised board by the very hands of the families who had suffered most. They had come without being asked. Ben Harlan brought his sons. Widow Delgado brought bread and stew to feed the workers. Even the old ranch hand who had confessed came quiet and steady, driving nails until his hands blistered, saying nothing but showing up every single day. They built it together. Inside, where Elias had once stored feed and where a little boy named Daniel had once chased barn cats through the straw, there was now a wide open hall. Long tables lined the walls. A stone hearth stood at the far end, warm and welcoming. And above the hearth hung two portraits side by side. One was Judge Thomas Whitmore, a man with kind, tired eyes who had given up his name and his good reputation to protect a frightened child. The other was Abigail. Clara had found the portrait tucked in an old trunk. It showed Abigail young, her head tilted just slightly, a small smile on her lips, as though she knew a secret worth keeping. Elias could hardly look at it those first weeks without his eyes filling. But slowly, day by day, looking became easier. And then it became a comfort. She was watching over the place now, just as she always had. Clara stayed in the valley. She had come meaning only to deliver a case and be gone, but the valley had taken hold of her the way it takes hold of everyone who lets it. She rented a small room in town and spent her days gathering the stories of the old families, writing them down, keeping them safe. The letters, the land records, her grandfather's journal. All of it she preserved with careful hands, building a place where the history could never be lost or twisted again. Somebody has to remember, she told Elias one afternoon, sorting papers by the light of the barn's tall windows. Not just the wrong that was done, but the people, the good ones, the ones who mattered. Elias understood that better than most. The ranch was recovering too. The cattle he had nearly given up on were fat and healthy on the spring grass. Young ranchers came to him now, hats in hand, asking his advice on breeding and fences and how to read the weather in the shape of the clouds. He never turned them away. He remembered too well how it felt to stand alone with no one to lean on. He was not alone anymore. The valley gathered in the barn often. On Sundays they came for supper. On quiet evenings they came just to sit near the hearth and talk. Children ran laughing across the floor where his own son had once played, and the sound of it did not break Elias's heart the way he once feared it would. It mended it. One evening near dusk, Elias walked out past the barn to the fence line. The sky was going gold and pink over the mountains, and the air smelled of turned earth and new grass. He leaned on the top rail and looked out over the land his father had loved, the land that was theirs again. For so long, he had lived only backward, living in the loss, living in the grief, turning over old sorrows like stones he could not put down. But standing there in the fading light, he felt something new stir inside him. He was not thinking of what he had lost. He was thinking of what came next. 1 year later, the valley came alive with the sound of celebration. Lanterns hung from the barn rafters, glowing soft and gold against the evening. Someone had strung ribbons across the wide doorway, and they fluttered in the warm breeze. Wagons lined the road all the way down to the bend in the creek. Folks had come from every corner of the valley, some traveling half a day just to be here. They wore their Sunday best, and their faces carried a light that Elias had not seen on them in years. He stood outside the barn with his hat in his hand, watching them arrive. Ben Harlan came up the road with his whole family, his sons grown taller now, his wife carrying a basket piled high with pies. Widow Delgado followed close behind, her gray hair pinned neat, her smile wide as the sky. Children ran ahead of their parents, laughing, chasing each other through the grass just as they had all spring and summer long. "Elias," Ben called out, raising a hand. "Fine night for it." "Finest we've had," Elias said. And he meant it. The barn was full of light and warmth. The long tables sagged under the weight of the food. There was roasted meat and fresh bread, jars of preserves and pies still steaming from the oven. Music started up in the corner, a fiddle and a guitar, and before long, a few brave souls were dancing across the wide floor. Elias moved through it all slow, shaking hands, clapping shoulders, listening. He had learned to listen these past 2 years. Folks stopped him to tell him things. A young man thanked him for the advice that had saved his first calving season. An old widow gripped his hand and told him with tears in her eyes that her husband could rest easy now that his name had been made clean. Elias only nodded. He did not need thanks, but he took each word and held it close because he understood now what it meant to a person to finally be seen. Clara found him near the hearth. She had grown into the valley the way roots grow into good soil. Her hands were ink-stained from her work, and her eyes were bright. "Look at them," she said softly, standing beside him. "A year ago, half these folks wouldn't meet each other's eyes. Now look." Elias looked. He saw families who had once carried shame like a weight around their necks. He saw them laughing. He saw them free. "You did this," Clara said. "No." He shook his head. "We did. All of us." She smiled and squeezed his arm, then drifted off to join the others. The music swelled, the children laughed, and Elias, for a moment, simply stood still in the middle of it all, letting it wash over him like the spring streams coming down off the ridges. Then his eyes lifted to the far wall. Above the stone hearth, the 2 portraits watched over the gathering. Judge Whitmore with his kind and tired eyes, and beside him, Abigail. Elias walked toward her slow, the noise of the celebration fading behind him. He stopped before the portrait and looked up into that gentle face, that small knowing smile. Fresh wildflowers sat on the mantel below, cut that very morning. Someone always kept them fresh. He suspected it was Clara. Maybe it was half the valley. He stood there a long while. The men who had taken everything were gone. Silas Crow had fallen, and his empire of lies had fallen with him. But standing there, Elias understood that Crow had never truly been the strongest force in the valley. Greed did not last. Cruelty did not last. Stolen land was returned, and forged papers turned to dust, and the men who thought money could bury the truth had learned that the truth had roots deeper than any grave. What lasted was this: the love a woman carried her whole life to protect the innocent, the courage of a judge who gave up his name to save a child, the truth that refused to stay buried no matter how deep they tried to bury it. Elias reached up and touched the edge of the frame. "You were right," he whispered, "about all of it." He had run from pain for so long. He had believed that fighting only brought more loss. But standing here now, surrounded by the laughter of a valley reborn, he saw the truth of it plain. Love, courage, and truth outlast every injustice. The cowboy who once ran from his grief had become the man the valley turned to for hope. And Abigail, watching over it all, seemed to smile a little wider. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.